I'll work your ranch and you'll be my wife." That's what the giant cowboy offered the struggling widow, right there in the dust with winter closing in. She had nothing left but a broken fence, 2 hungry children, and a name the bank was ready to bury. Then came a man built like the land itself, quiet, solemn, and carrying more than just saddle scars. Folks whispered soon as they saw him step into church beside her. Not because he spoke, but because of where he came from. And who he was. The town wasn't ready, and the man who wanted her land? He'd make sure this stranger paid, but what none of them saw coming was how far this woman might go to protect what little she had left, and the man who asked nothing but to stand beside her. When the snow falls and the bell tolls, what will she choose? Safety, or something like love? And when the fire comes, will they burn together, or stand through it? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Eliza Morley braced herself against the broken wagon tongue. Her muscles strained with the effort, but the heavy wooden beam wouldn't budge. Sweat trickled down her neck, and her arms trembled from repeated attempts to lift the splintered oak. "Mama, let me help!" 8-year-old Clara called from the porch, where she sat with 6-year-old James. "Stay put, both of you," Eliza said, her breath coming in short gasps. "This timber's too heavy." The wagon sat cockeyed in the yard, its tongue snapped clean through where the mules had spooked that morning. They'd taken off running when a rattler had surprised them, leaving Eliza with yet another repair she couldn't manage alone. She straightened, pressing her palm against her aching lower back. The broken tongue mocked her determination to handle everything herself. Since losing Thomas last winter, she'd learned to mend fences, patch the roof, and doctor sick livestock. But some tasks required more strength than she possessed. The crunch of boots on gravel made her whirl around. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the cottonwoods lining the trail. Eliza's heart jumped as she took in his impressive height, easily 6.5 feet. His brown skin was weathered from long days in the sun, and quiet strength radiated from his broad shoulders. The stranger's dark eyes met hers briefly, then dropped to the broken wagon. Without a word, he stepped forward and wrapped his large hands around the timber. In one fluid motion, he lifted the tongue and guided it into position. "Much obliged," Eliza managed, trying to hide how his sudden appearance had startled her. "I'm Eliza Morley." "Boaz Carver." His voice was soft and deep, like distant thunder. "Former cavalry scout, heading to Miles City looking for work?" Clara and James had crept closer, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Eliza noticed how Boaz acknowledged them with a gentle nod, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone used to being around skittish horses. "Least I can do is offer you coffee for your trouble," Eliza said, smoothing her apron. "We just finished supper, but there's still some cornbread if you're hungry." A slight smile touched his lips. "That's kind of you, Mom." Inside the cabin, lamplight gleamed on the clean-swept floors and simple furnishings. While the children peppered Boaz with questions about his scout days, Eliza spooned coffee into the pot and set it to boil. His answers were brief but patient, and she noticed how he spoke to them as equals, not dismissing their curiosity. After the meal, Eliza showed him to the barn. "The hayloft's dry, if you'd like to bed down there for the night." "Much appreciated." He ducked his head in thanks and climbed the ladder with surprising grace for such a large man. Later that evening, after tucking the children into bed, Eliza noticed an envelope tucked under her saddlebag on the porch. Her hands trembled as she recognized the bank's letterhead. Inside was the notice she'd been dreading, foreclosure by week's end if she couldn't make payment. Eliza sank into the rocking chair, Thomas's ring cold against her chest where it hung on a leather cord. The lamp's flame flickered as she bowed her head in prayer, her whispered words barely stirring the night air. "Lord, I don't know how much more I can bear," she murmured. "The children need their home. I need help." Through the open window, she could hear the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls, and somewhere in the hayloft, the quiet breathing of a stranger who had appeared just when she needed strength beyond her own. Perhaps, she thought, the Lord moved in mysterious ways indeed. In the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon, and a cool breeze carried the sweet scent of prairie grass through the yard. Eliza remained in her chair, the foreclosure notice crumpled in her lap, watching as stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but for tonight, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in months, a small, fragile spark of hope. From the barn came the gentle creak of timbers settling, reminding her that she wasn't completely alone. The stranger's presence, though unexpected, had already eased one burden. As she finally rose to head inside, Eliza wondered what other changes Boaz Carver's arrival might bring to their quiet ranch. The first hint of dawn painted the sky in pale strokes when Eliza heard hammering from the direction of the chicken coop. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped onto the porch, steam rising from her morning coffee. There stood Boaz Carver, his broad shoulders hunched as he worked, already replacing the loose boards that had plagued her for months. The early light caught the silver threads in his dark hair as he moved with quiet efficiency, each nail driven home with precise strikes. He'd found the spare lumber she'd stored behind the barn, along with her late husband's tools. The sight of a stranger handling Thomas's hammer made her throat tight. Eliza watched him work, her feelings tangled like yarn after kittens got to it. The man's capable hands spoke of honest work, yet experience had taught her that kindness often came with hidden costs. Still, there was something in his deliberate movements that reminded her of Thomas, that same careful attention to doing things right. The chicken strutted around his boots, unfazed by his presence. Even the mean old rooster that usually attacked anything in pants seemed to accept him. Boaz paused occasionally to toss scratch to the hens, his movements gentle despite his imposing size. When Clara and James tumbled out onto the porch, their sleepy faces brightening at the sight of eggs and bacon, Eliza called out to their visitor. "Breakfast is ready, Mr. Carver, if you've a mind to join us." He nodded, carefully returning Thomas's tools to their proper places before washing up at the pump. The children scooted their chairs closer to his when he sat down, already treating him like a familiar presence rather than the stranger he was. After grace was said and plates were filled, Boaz cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'd like to speak plain, if you'll permit it." Eliza's hand stilled over the coffee pot. "Go ahead. I've got no family to speak of," he said, his deep voice soft but steady. "Just a discharged cavalry horse, and these two hands that need honest work." "Mr. Carver, I'm grateful for your help, but I can't pay—" "Then I'll work your ranch," he interrupted gently, meeting her eyes. "And you'll be my wife." The tin cup slipped from Eliza's fingers, clattering against the table. Coffee splashed across the oilcloth as she stared at him, heat rising in her cheeks. The children fell silent, looking between the adults with wide eyes. Boaz held up his hand, as if to calm a startled horse. "I don't mean to frighten you, Mrs. Morley. I saw the foreclosure notice last night. Paper was sticking out of your saddlebag. A woman alone with two young ones, banks likely to show no mercy." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But a married woman with a working husband, that might give them pause." "Mr. Carver, I hardly know you," Eliza whispered. "True enough." He nodded. "And I'm not asking for more than you're willing to give. No intimacy unless you want it. Just my name tied to yours, my labor to keep this land under your feet." His calm gaze held hers. "I've seen too many good folks lose everything to men who only see numbers in their ledgers." Eliza's hands trembled as she mopped up the spilled coffee. The proposal was shocking, improper even. Yet there was nothing improper in the way Boaz sat, maintaining a respectful distance, his manner direct but gentle. "I need time to think," she managed. "Of course." He rose from the table, nodding his thanks for the meal. "I'll see to that loose gate hinge while there's still morning light." Throughout the day, Eliza watched him work. He moved from task to task as if he'd always been there, knowing what needed doing without being told. The broken pump handle, the sagging fence rail, the stuck barn door, each was fixed with quiet competence. Clara followed him like a shadow, chattering away as she handed him tools or held boards in place. When Eliza called her in to help with supper, the little girl's eyes shone with admiration. "Mama," Clara whispered as they peeled potatoes together. "I like the giant man. He listens real good, and he showed me how to test wood for rot, just like Papa used to do." Eliza's heart squeezed at the comparison. After the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's Bible open before her. The worn pages fell naturally to Proverbs, where her husband had often sought guidance. The lamplight flickered across familiar verses about wisdom and prudence. Her fingers traced Thomas's notes in the margins as she weighed her options. The bank would show no mercy. She knew that much. Banker Silas Durney had made that clear enough with his tight smiles and cold eyes. Without help, she and the children would lose everything Thomas had worked so hard to build. She looked out the window toward the barn, where Boaz had once again bedded down in the hayloft. His strange proposal offered a way forward, albeit one she'd never imagined for herself. As she sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the life she and Thomas had built together, Eliza began to understand that sometimes Providence wore unexpected faces. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Eliza's fingers trembled as she buttoned Clara's best dress, the blue cotton one she'd stayed up late mending just last week. James squirmed as she smoothed down his collar, but didn't protest when she licked her thumb to tame a stubborn cowlick. "Stand still now," she murmured, straightening his suspenders. "We need to look our best for church." Outside, the wagon wheels creaked as she hitched up the team. The familiar sounds of Sunday morning filled the air, birds singing, horses nickering, and the distant toll of the church bell carrying across the prairie. When she rounded the barn, she found Boaz already waiting by the fence. He'd cleaned up proper, his face freshly shaved and his threadbare black coat brushed free of dust. Though the coat had seen better days, it was evident he'd taken care with his appearance. The four of them climbed into the wagon without speaking. Eliza held the reins while Boaz sat beside her, a respectful distance between them. Clara and James bounced on the back bench, their excited whispers the only sound besides the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of leather. The white clapboard church stood proud against the morning sky, its modest steeple reaching toward heaven. Wagons and buggies clustered around it like faithful sheep around their shepherd. Eliza felt the weight of curious stares as Boaz helped her and the children down from the wagon. Inside, they settled into a pew near the middle, the familiar scents of beeswax candles and well-worn hymnals wrapped around them. Reverend Calvin stood at the pulpit, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the light as he opened his Bible. "Today," the Reverend began, his gentle voice filling the small space, "we turn to the Book of Ruth." Eliza's breath caught. The Reverend spoke of faith and loyalty, of a foreign woman who chose to bind her life to her mother-in-law's people. When he reached the part about Ruth and Boaz, the kinsman redeemer who offered marriage to protect a widow's inheritance, tears slipped down Eliza's cheeks. "And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, Ye are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's." Reverend Calvin read, his voice strong and clear. "Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess have I purchased to be my wife." The words seemed to echo in the quiet church. Eliza felt Boaz shift slightly beside her, his presence solid and steady as a mountain. She wiped her tears with trembling fingers, aware of the curious glances from nearby pews. After the final hymn, while the congregation gathered their things, Eliza touched Reverend Calvin's sleeve. "Might I have a word in private, Reverend?" The elderly preacher nodded, leading them to his small study off the sanctuary. When Eliza explained their intention to marry, right then that very day, his bushy eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline. "My dear," he said carefully, "are you certain about this?" "I am," Eliza replied, her voice stronger than she felt. The Lord provides in mysterious ways, Reverend, sometimes through strangers who become family. The Reverend studied them both for a long moment, his kind eyes thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. Very well, we'll do it proper, before the congregation as witnesses. They stood before the altar, Eliza in her best calico dress and Boaz in his worn coat. Clara and James stood beside them, their faces shining with excitement. The Reverend's words rang out clear and true as he joined them in marriage. Whispers rustled through the church like wind through prairie grass. Near the back, banker Silas Durney's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. But Eliza kept her eyes forward, focusing on the Reverend's words and the warm strength of Boaz's hand as he slipped a simple brass ring onto her finger. The ride home was quiet, save for the children's chatter. Clara kept asking to see Eliza's ring, while James wondered aloud if he could start calling Boaz Pa. Eliza's heart ached at the question, but Boaz handled it with gentle grace. "Best stick with Mr. Boaz for now, young fellow," he said quietly. "We'll see how things settle." Evening settled over the ranch like a soft blanket. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the children went to bed with minimal fuss, worn out from the day's excitement. Eliza stood awkwardly in the kitchen, aware of Boaz gathering his blanket from the wagon. "I'll bed down in the hayloft again," he said, his voice gentle. "No need to change things too quick-like." Eliza nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Carver." Boaz. "Rest well, Mrs. Carver," he replied, touching the brim of his hat before heading out to the barn. Eliza watched through the window as his tall figure disappeared into the gathering dusk. The brass ring on her finger caught the lamplight, a silent reminder of all that had changed and all that remained uncertain. Dawn painted the prairie sky in shades of pink and gold as Boaz climbed down from the hayloft. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he made his way to the broken windmill. The metal blades creaked in protest against the morning breeze, their rusty joints crying out for attention. Inside the ranch house, the steady thump-thump of the butter churn echoed as Eliza worked, her arms moving in a familiar rhythm. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, catching the new brass ring on her finger. She paused to wipe her brow, watching through the window as Boaz examined the windmill's mechanisms. The tall man moved with quiet purpose, his strong hands working methodically with the tools he'd brought from his saddlebags. The worn leather of his work gloves seemed to know every bolt and bearing as he loosened, cleaned, and tightened each part. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the yard as he worked. Clara's small boots kicked up dust as she hurried across the yard, carefully carrying a tin cup of water with both hands. "Mr. Boaz?" she called out, her voice bright as a meadowlark. "Mama said you might be thirsty." Boaz climbed down from his perch and knelt to accept the cup, his weathered face softening into a gentle smile. "Much obliged, Miss Clara," he said, his deep voice warm with gratitude. The little girl beamed, settling herself on a nearby wooden crate to watch him work. "How do you know which parts go where?" Clara asked, tilting her head as Boaz returned to his task. "Every piece has its purpose," he explained, his voice carrying the patience of a natural teacher. "Like how every creature on God's earth has its place. You just need to listen to what each part is telling you." Clara nodded solemnly, her eyes wide with wonder as the windmill's blades began to turn more smoothly, their song changing from a protest to a gentle rhythm. Later that morning, James approached the fence line where Boaz was checking for loose posts. The boy clutched a broken bird trap, its twine tangled and useless. "Sir?" James shuffled his feet in the dust. "Could you help me fix this? My father, he showed me once, but I can't remember how." Boaz set down his tools and gestured for James to join him in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Here," he said, taking the trap gently. "Let me show you something my grandfather taught me. A Cheyenne knot that won't never come loose." His large hands moved slowly, deliberately, showing James how to weave the twine in an intricate pattern. See here? The rope becomes stronger where it crosses over itself, like family supporting each other. James's small fingers followed Boaz's movements, his face scrunched in concentration. When the knot held firm under testing, the boy's face lit up with pride. That evening, the family gathered around the supper table. The usual silence had given way to Clara's cheerful chatter about the windmill repair and James's excited explanation of his new knot-tying skills. Eliza passed the cornbread, her movements less stiff than before, and even managed a small smile when Boaz complimented her cooking. As darkness settled over the prairie, Eliza stood in the doorway of the small room off the kitchen. "You shouldn't sleep in the barn anymore," she said quietly, not quite meeting Boaz's eyes. "This room, it's yours now, if you want it." Boaz nodded, understanding the trust being offered. "Thank you, Mrs. Carver." "Here," she added, holding out a pillow with carefully mended seams. "For your bed." Meanwhile, in town, different scenes played out. At Miller's General Store, Mrs. Henderson leaned over the counter, her voice hushed but sharp. "Did you hear? Eliza Morley went and married that Cheyenne half-breed who's been hanging around. Right there in church, bold as brass. Times must be desperate indeed." Another woman clucked, shaking her head. "Poor thing, with 2 young ones to feed." The whispers traveled down the street to the Golden Spur Saloon, where Franklin Todge sat nursing his 3rd whiskey of the evening. When the bartender mentioned the marriage, Todge's face darkened like a thunderhead. His fist came down hard on the bar, sending his empty glass skittering across the wood. "That ranch was supposed to be mine," he snarled, his cultured voice rough with anger. "I've been working on that deal for months, and now some mudblood drifter thinks he can just walk in and take it?" The other patrons edged away as Todge stood, his expensive coat catching the lamplight. "I won't let some mixed-blood savage interfere with my plans," he muttered, reaching for the whiskey bottle. "That grazing line is too important." The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Franklin Todge's polished boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk. He adjusted his silk cravat, pushed open the heavy oak door of First Territory Bank, and strode past the empty teller windows to Banker Durney's private office. Silas Durney looked up from his ledger, his round spectacles catching the lamplight. "Mr. Todge, what brings you by so early?" Franklin settled his considerable frame into the leather chair across from Durney's desk. "That marriage certificate doesn't change the facts, Silas. The Morley place, or should I say the Carver place now, is still in arrears." Durney's pen scratched against paper as he shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, technically speaking, but with a man working the land now." "A man?" Todge's laugh held no warmth. "That half-breed scout. Since when does a piece of paper from Reverend Calvin change the bank's position on sound financial decisions?" "The town's watching this one closely," Durney muttered, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "Sunday's sermon was all about Ruth and Boaz. Biblical precedent, you understand. The Ladies' Aid Society is quite taken with the story." Todge's fingers drummed against the desk's polished surface. "I see." He stood, straightening his coat. "Good day then, Silas. I trust you'll remember who's backed your loans these past 15 years when the time comes." The banker's weak protest followed him out, but Todge paid it no mind. He had other ways to handle matters. That afternoon, his horse's hooves kicked up dust along the creek trail as he rode upstream. The old damkeeper's cabin sat in a grove of cottonwoods, smoke curling from its chimney. Todge dismounted, his saddlebags heavy with coins. "Afternoon, Jensen," he called out. The grizzled damkeeper emerged, squinting in the sunlight. "I've got a business proposition for you." An hour later, Todge rode away, satisfied. Jensen's greedy eyes had lit up at the sight of the gold pieces, more than enough to ensure the water flow to the Morley Carver place would find a new path. As evening approached, Eliza walked to the stock troughs, bucket in hand. She stopped short, her heart sinking. The wooden troughs stood empty, their bottoms dry and cracking. Even the creek bed, which had always run steady and true, showed only a trickle. "Boaz!" she called out, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Without water, the cattle wouldn't last 3 days. He appeared from the barn, took one look at the troughs, and grabbed his hat. "I'll check upstream," he said quietly. "Get the children to fill every bucket we have from the well. We'll make do tonight." Darkness had settled when Boaz returned, his expression grim in the lamplight. Eliza set out bowls of bean soup and cornbread, watching as he cleaned his hands at the wash basin. "Someone's diverted the flow," he said finally, settling at the table. "Dam's been adjusted upstream. Not natural changing." Clara and James exchanged worried glances. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she served the soup. "Can anything be done?" Boaz nodded slowly, breaking his cornbread. "Got me an idea. Saw something similar when I scouted near Fort Laramie. Need them barrel hoops from behind the barn and that stack of roofing tin your late husband never used." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Eliza stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, watching as Boaz worked. His strong hands moved with purpose, bending metal and securing joints. Clara helped by carrying tools, while James held boards steady. By midday, an ingenious system of gutters and barrels took shape. The tin sheets, carefully angled, would catch rain and morning dew, channeling every precious drop into the connected barrels. The old barrel hoops, reshaped and secured, held everything in place like ribs supporting a metal spine. Eliza's throat tightened as she watched. John had been a good man, a faithful husband, but he'd never shown this kind of resourcefulness. He would have ridden to town, spent precious dollars on new equipment, or worse, taken out another loan. Boaz worked steadily through the afternoon, checking each connection, testing the flow with buckets of well water. When he finally stepped back, wiping his brow, the system stood ready. A testament to frontier ingenuity. "It'll catch the night dew too," he explained, pointing to the wide tin sheets. "Won't replace the creek entirely, but it'll keep the stock alive until we figure something else." Eliza nodded, understanding in her bones that this quiet protection, this careful planning and skilled hands, was worth more than all the water in the territory. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning far more than just the cistern catch system. Boaz touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting hers briefly before turning back to his work. The afternoon sun caught the metal sheets, making them shine like silver against the prairie sky. The morning mail brought a crisp envelope from First Territory Bank. Eliza's hands trembled as she broke the waxed seal. Inside, formal letterhead announced a 30-day extension on their debt obligation. She sank into the kitchen chair, relief washing over her like spring rain. "Good news?" Boaz asked quietly from the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow across the worn floorboards. "A month's grace," Eliza managed, her voice thick with emotion. "The bank's giving us 30 days more." She knew it was Boaz's presence that had swayed them. A man's name carried weight, even if some folks looked down on his heritage. He nodded once, then turned back to his work. The day passed peacefully enough, with Boaz repairing fence posts while James helped carry tools. Clara spent the afternoon gathering eggs, humming hymns to herself as she worked. But at supper, Clara barely touched her stew. Her usually bright eyes looked glassy, and her cheeks blazed with unnatural color. "Mama," she whispered, pushing away her bowl, "I don't feel right." Eliza pressed her palm to Clara's forehead and gasped at the heat radiating from her daughter's skin. "Lord have mercy, you're burning up, child." Boaz rose from his chair immediately, his expression grave. "Mrs. Greaves," he said, "the midwife, she knows healing." "But she's 12 miles out," Eliza protested, gathering Clara into her arms. "And look at the weather, it's turning fierce." Indeed, sleet had begun to rattle against the window panes, driven by a bitter wind that howled through every crack in the cabin walls. But Boaz was already pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll fetch her," he said simply, reaching for his hat. "Boaz, you can't. It's too dangerous in this weather." Eliza called after him, but he was already striding toward the barn. Through the window, she watched him saddle his horse with swift, sure movements. The sleet had turned the yard into a treacherous sheet of ice, but Boaz mounted smoothly and urged his horse forward into the gathering storm. Hours crawled by like wounded things. Eliza sat beside Clara's bed, changing cool cloths on her forehead and praying without cease. James huddled nearby in his father's old rocker, clutching his wooden horse for comfort. "Please, Lord," Eliza whispered, holding Clara's hot little hand. "Please spare my girl." Memories of John's final illness threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed them away. She couldn't lose another loved one. She couldn't. Clara tossed restlessly, calling out for her papa in her fever dreams. Eliza's heart clenched at the word, knowing Clara meant Boaz now, not John. When had that happened? When had this quiet giant of a man become so essential to their family? The clock struck 11, then midnight. The storm raged on, but Eliza heard something else beneath its fury, hoofbeats growing closer. She rushed to the door just as Boaz appeared out of the darkness, leading his exhausted horse. Behind him sat Mrs. Greaves, wrapped in layers of quilts. "Land's sake, child," the midwife declared as she bustled inside, shaking off snow and ice. "Lucky thing your man there knows every trail in the territory. Anyone else would have lost their way 3 times over in this weather." Boaz stood dripping by the door, his clothes frozen stiff, but his eyes sought only Clara's small form on the bed. Mrs. Greaves went straight to work, mixing herbs from her medical bag and brewing a strong-smelling tea. "Get those wet things off him," she ordered Eliza. "Before he catches his death, I'll tend to the little one." Eliza helped Boaz remove his frozen coat and boots, noticing how his hands shook with cold. She brought him dry clothes and a blanket, then hurried back to Clara's bedside. Together, they watched as Mrs. Greaves coaxed the bitter tea into Clara, spoonful by spoonful. The hours crept toward dawn. Outside, the storm gradually spent itself, leaving behind an eerie silence. Inside, Clara's breathing grew easier, her skin cooler to the touch. Just as the first grey light appeared in the east, her fever broke. "She'll sleep natural now," Mrs. Greaves announced, packing up her supplies. "Keep her warm and quiet today, but the danger's past." Eliza's legs gave way, and she sank onto the edge of Clara's bed. Tears she'd been holding back all night spilled down her cheeks. Through their blur, she saw Boaz still standing guard in the corner, exhaustion written in every line of his body. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him. "Thank you for bringing Mrs. Greaves, for everything." He met her gaze, and something passed between them, something deeper than gratitude or duty. In that moment, Eliza saw him truly, not as a convenient solution to their troubles, not as merely a helper, but as the head of their family, a man who would ride through ice and darkness to save her child, a man who asked nothing but gave everything. Mrs. Greaves watched this silent exchange with knowing eyes. "Well," she said briskly, "I reckon I could use a cup of coffee before heading home, though I expect your man there needs sleep more than anything." A week passed like honey dripping from a spoon, sweet and slow. Clara regained her strength day by day, color returning to her cheeks as surely as spring follows winter. The whole family breathed easier, especially Boaz, who'd taken to checking on her 3 times each night. One morning, while Clara sat wrapped in quilts on the porch watching James chase chickens, Eliza worked up her courage. She found Boaz in the barn, fixing a broken harness with careful stitches. "The harvest social's coming Saturday?" she said, her voice sounding thin in the dusty air. "I thought, well, perhaps we might attend, as a family." Boaz's hand stilled on the leather. "Folks might not take kindly to seeing me there." "You're my husband," Eliza said, the words feeling more natural now. "And the children would love it." He studied the harness for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're certain." That afternoon, Eliza pulled her best gingham dress from the cedar chest, running her fingers over the worn hem. She hadn't touched it since John's funeral. Now, sitting by lamplight after the children were abed, she carefully picked out the old stitches and began to sew a new hem. Her needle flashed in and out of the fabric as memories washed over her, of dances with John, of courting days long past. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering if her hair looked nice, if the dress would still fit properly. The thought made her cheeks warm. Saturday evening arrived clear and crisp. Boaz had polished his boots until they gleamed, and though his suit was plain, he cut an impressive figure. Clara insisted on wearing her hair in 2 braids, like Pa's horse's mane, while James proudly sported his Sunday collar. The social hall glowed with lantern light when they arrived, fiddle music spilling out into the twilight. Conversations stuttered to a halt as they entered. Eliza felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispers behind raised hands. Boaz stood straight and calm beside her, though she noticed his jaw tightened slightly. They found seats along the wall, watching other couples twirl across the planked floor. No one approached to ask them to dance. Clara munched contentedly on sugar cookies while James fidgeted, his eyes following the dancers. Finally, the boy could contain himself no longer. He jumped up and tugged at Boaz's sleeve. "Pa, come dance! Ma says you know how!" Boaz glanced at Eliza, uncertainty in his eyes. She gave him a small nod, and he allowed James to pull him to his feet. The boy tried to copy the other dancers, stepping on Boaz's toes more often than not. But Boaz guided him patiently, his face softening with genuine joy. Watching them, something shifted in Eliza's heart. Before she could think better of it, she stood and walked to where they danced. Boaz turned to her, and without a word opened his arms. They moved together as if they'd practiced for years. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, keeping a respectful distance between them. They swayed to the gentle fiddle tune, and Eliza found herself relaxing into the movement, into the simple rightness of it. "You dance well," she murmured, surprised. "Cavalry balls," he explained quietly. "Had to learn." As they turned, Eliza caught sight of Mrs. Peterson, wife of the largest rancher in the county. The older woman gave her a slight but deliberate nod. "Bold choice, dear," Mrs. Peterson said later, as they were gathering their things to leave. "But the right one, I'd say." She patted Eliza's hand and moved away before Eliza could respond. The wagon ride home was peaceful. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar, and a quarter moon hung low on the horizon. Clara fell asleep against Boaz's shoulder while James fought to keep his eyes open. But what struck Eliza most was Boaz's smile, small but constant, like he couldn't quite help himself. At home, after the children were tucked in bed, they sat before the hearth. The fire painted everything in soft gold, and Eliza felt brave in its warm light. Slowly, carefully, she reached for Boaz's hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. His fingers were rough with calluses but gentle as they closed around hers. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the flames dance. Then Boaz slowly withdrew his hand and stood. "I won't cross any line you haven't drawn," he said softly, his voice deep with emotion, but firm with conviction. "Good night, Eliza." She watched him walk to his room, his steps measured and deliberate. The space where his hand had been felt cold now, but her heart was warm with something that felt surprisingly like hope. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when hoofbeats echoed across the yard. A courier from the Cheyenne agency dismounted, his horse's flanks dark with sweat from the hard ride. He handed over a thick envelope and departed without a word, leaving only dust in his wake. Eliza found Boaz in the barn, his broad shoulders bent over a broken hay rake. The official seal on the envelope made her stomach twist. "There's a letter," she said softly. Boaz straightened, his face going still when he saw the agency markings. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took the envelope, but made no move to open it. "Would you like me to read it?" Eliza offered, seeing the tension in his jaw. He nodded once, handing it back. Eliza broke the seal and unfolded the crisp paper. Her eyes scanned the formal language, and her heart sank. To Boaz Carver. She read aloud, her voice growing tighter with each word. Notice is hereby given that your land allotment of 80 acres in Township 18 North, Range 54 East, is declared null and void due to your recent interracial marriage, which violates territorial statutes regarding Indian allotments. The words echoed in the quiet barn. Boaz stood motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Only the slight whitening of his knuckles betrayed his emotion. There's more, Eliza continued, her hands shaking. The land will revert to public domain for reassignment. She couldn't finish. Boaz, I'm so sorry. He took a deep breath. Nothing to be sorry for. What's done is done. Later that afternoon, while Eliza was in town buying supplies, she overheard Franklin Todge's booming voice from the saloon. He was holding court among his usual crowd of hangers-on, a whiskey glass gleaming in his meaty hand. Ain't hard when you know the right people, he was saying, pride thick in his voice. Few words with my old cavalry friends, right papers pushed across right desks. He laughed. That's all it takes to remind some folks where they belong. Eliza's hands clenched around her basket. The flour sack split, spilling white powder across her skirts, but she barely noticed. She hurried home, anger burning in her throat. The sun had set by the time she found the courage to confront Boaz. He was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a small wooden horse for James. The lamplight from inside cast long shadows across the yard. You have to fight this, she said without preamble. Boaz's knife stilled. No point in fighting. No point? Eliza's voice rose. That land is yours by right, by law. Franklin Todge pulled strings to steal it from you, and you're just going to let him. This is where I want to be. His voice was quiet but firm. With the children. With you. Don't you see? Tears pricked at her eyes. He'll never stop. Men like him never do. They'll take and take until there's nothing left. Not your land, not your dignity, not your heritage. Boaz stood slowly, tucking the half-finished horse into his pocket. Some battles aren't worth the cost. And some are. Eliza marched into the house, returning moments later with their marriage certificate. The paper glowed golden in the lamplight. This is what's stopping you from claiming what's rightfully yours. This is what they're using against you. She moved to the hearth, where embers still glowed from supper's fire. Boaz watched her, his face unreadable. What are you doing, Eliza? Giving you back your choice. She held the certificate over the coals. Your land is your birthright, your connection to your people. I won't be the reason you lose that. Eliza. His voice held a warning. You saved us, she whispered. Now let me save something for you. She released the paper. It caught quickly, curling and blackening in the heat. Boaz moved to stand beside her. Together they watched their marriage burn to ash. The flames reflected in his dark eyes, and after a long moment he nodded slowly. Thank you, he said softly, and in those two words Eliza heard everything he couldn't say. His grief, his gratitude, and something else that made her heart ache with its intensity. She turned away before he could see her tears, but his gentle hand on her shoulder stopped her. They stood there in silence, watching the last fragments of paper turn to smoke, each lost in thoughts of what might have been and what must now be. The morning frost painted delicate patterns across the window panes when Boaz shouldered his saddlebags in the grey dawn light. His horse's breath came out in white puffs as he tightened the cinch, each movement deliberate and quiet. He paused at the barn door, looking back at the silent house where 3 hearts still slept, unaware of his departure. Eliza woke to unusual stillness. The familiar sounds of Boaz splitting wood or drawing water were absent. She knew before her feet touched the cold floorboards that he was gone. His room off the kitchen stood empty, the bed neatly made. Only his old coat remained, hanging like a shadow behind the door. Clara found her in the kitchen, staring at the cold stove. Mama, where's Pa Boaz? The question pierced Eliza's heart. She gathered both children close, breathing in the sweet scent of their hair. Boaz had to go away for a while, she explained, keeping her voice steady. There were some problems with his land that belongs to him and his people. He needs to make things right. But when's he coming back? James demanded, his small face scrunching up in anger. Eliza smoothed his tousled hair. I don't know, sweetheart. The days crept by like molasses in winter. Eliza threw herself into work, trying to fill the void Boaz left behind, but every task reminded her of his absence. The woodpile dwindled faster than she could replenish it, her arms aching from wielding the heavy axe. The barn roof began to leak, and she had no way to climb up and patch it. When the first real cold snap hit, the water barrels froze solid. Eliza spent hours chipping ice, her fingers raw and red, remembering how Boaz had known exactly where to position the barrels to catch the weak winter sun. James grew sullen and defiant. I hate him, he declared one evening, kicking over his bowl of beans. He left us just like Pa did. James Morley. Eliza's voice cracked like a whip. Your father died. Boaz chose to protect what was his by birth. There's a difference. But later that night, she heard muffled sobs from his bed and sat with him until he fell asleep, his damp face pressed against her shoulder. Clara's grief showed differently. She stopped singing her made-up songs and spent hours at the window, watching the road. Every rider that passed made her jump up with hope, only to slump back down in disappointment. At night, after the children were asleep, Eliza allowed herself to feel the weight of her solitude. She would touch Boaz's coat, hanging by the door, the rough wool holding memories of his quiet strength. Sometimes she caught herself talking to it, telling him about her day, about the children, about how the ranch was slowly slipping through her fingers like sand. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Boaz stood before the Indian Agency office, his discharge papers spread across the clerk's desk. The young man behind the counter looked nervous under Boaz's steady gaze. There seems to be some confusion regarding your tribal status, Mr. Carver. The clerk stammered, shuffling through more papers. According to these records, you're classified as... I'm Cheyenne, Boaz stated firmly. My mother was Northern Cheyenne. My father was a cavalry sergeant. Both facts are in those papers. Hours of questioning revealed what Boaz had suspected. A clerk admitted that Franklin Todge had offered him $50 to misplace certain documents and alter Boaz's tribal classification. The man's hands shook as he signed a confession. That evening, Boaz composed a careful telegram to the army chaplain who had known both his parents. The old man now worked in the land office in Bismarck, and his word carried weight with the territorial authorities. Requesting assistance, stop land allotment fraudulently voided. Stop have written confession of bribery. Stop papers follow by post. Stop respectfully B. Carver. Stop. In the boarding house that night, Boaz lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows. He thought of Eliza, wondering if she had enough firewood, if the children were warm enough, if she regretted burning their marriage certificate. His hand strayed to the small wooden horse in his pocket, still unfinished, waiting for James's small hands to hold it. The next morning brought heavy snow. Boaz stood at the agency window, watching the flakes swirl down. Somewhere to the west, across the vast white prairie, Eliza would be fighting her own battles against the cold, against loneliness, against a world that seemed determined to break everything they had built together. He touched the telegram receipt in his pocket, his jaw set with determination. This battle wasn't just about land anymore. It was about justice, about family, about the right to choose where and how to belong. And somewhere between the legal papers and his aching heart, Boaz knew that his true home wasn't on either parcel of land. It was wherever Eliza and the children waited for his return. The winter wind howled across the empty prairie, driving snow against the farmhouse windows. Eliza huddled closer to the stove, watching Clara mend a torn quilt while James dozed in the corner. 2 weeks had passed since Boaz's departure, each day harder than the last. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, matching the chill in her heart. A sharp knock at the door startled them all. James jerked awake, and Clara dropped her needle. Eliza's hands trembled as she opened the door to find Joe Wheeler, the wagon courier, stamping snow from his boots. "Evening, Ms. Morley," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Got something here you need to see." Eliza unfolded the document at the kitchen table, her throat tightening as she read. Franklin Todge had filed papers with the bank, declaring his intent to purchase her ranch the moment the debt was called due. The formal language couldn't hide the threat beneath. He was circling like a vulture, waiting for her to fail. After Wheeler left, Eliza sank into her chair, the paper crumpling in her fist. The children watched her with worried eyes. Without Boaz's strength and knowledge, the spring planting would be impossible. The stock would suffer. The ranch would slip away like water through her fingers. "Mama?" Clara's small voice broke through her thoughts. "Is Mr. Todge going to take our home?" Eliza pulled her daughter close. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart." But her words felt hollow, even to herself. 200 miles away in Miles City, Boaz stood before the Federal Claims Office, his weathered hat in his hands. Beside him, Army Chaplain Thomas Morgan's white hair gleamed in the morning light streaming through the dusty windows. The old man's eyes were sharp as he faced the clerk. "I remember the day Boaz was born," Chaplain Morgan declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I was there when his mother, Morning Star, gave him life. She was registered with the Northern Cheyenne, a fact documented in both tribal and military records." The clerk shuffled through a stack of yellowed papers. "But the adoption. The adoption by Sergeant Carver never nullified his mother's bloodline." Morgan interrupted. "I performed the ceremony myself. Those papers clearly state that Boaz's Cheyenne heritage remained legally recognized." Boaz watched silently as the chaplain pressed their case. He remembered the old man's kindness during his childhood years at the fort, how he'd always treated both soldiers and native people with equal respect. Now that same determination showed in every line of his face. "Furthermore," Morgan continued, pulling out another document, "I have here the original birth record, signed by the agency doctor. It clearly states Morning Star's tribal affiliation." The clerk examined the papers carefully, his brow furrowed. Finally, he looked up. "These documents appear to be in order. The suspension of your allotment claim was clearly based on falsified information." He reached for an official stamp. "I'll mark this for reversal, pending agency approval." Boaz's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his face remained composed. It was a small victory, but an important one. The chaplain clapped him on the back as they left the office. "It might take a few weeks for the final approval," Morgan said as they walked through the snowy streets. "But they can't deny the truth of these papers. Your land will be restored to you." Boaz nodded, thinking of another piece of land, and the family waiting there. "Much obliged, chaplain, for everything." The old man's eyes twinkled. "You know, son, having your allotment doesn't mean you have to live on it. A man can own land in one place and make his home in another." That evening, in his rented room, Boaz began preparing for the journey back. He cleaned his rifle and checked his supplies, knowing the winter trails would be treacherous. His saddlebags were mostly empty. He'd need room for the supplies Eliza and the children would need. As he worked, his mind wandered to the ranch. The stock would need extra feed by now. The north fence probably needed mending after the heavy snows. The children would be burning through firewood faster than Eliza could split it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small wooden horse he'd been carving. His knife moved steadily over the wood, shaping the final details. James would need something to smile about when he returned. The chaplain's words echoed in his mind as he worked. A man's home wasn't just about ownership. It was about where his heart took root. His Cheyenne mother had taught him that the earth itself was sacred, but so were the bonds between people. Both truths could live together, just as both sides of his heritage lived in him. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey back. The agency's final approval would follow him when it came. For now, there were more important matters waiting: a ranch to save, children to protect, and a woman whose trust he had earned and whose heart he hoped to heal. Another week crept by at the Morley Ranch, each day marked by the steady rhythm of farm life. Eliza stood at the kitchen counter, her hands deep in bread dough, surprising herself with a gentle tune that escaped her lips. The familiar hymn filled the warm kitchen as afternoon sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows. She caught herself mid-verse and pressed her lips together, denying the flutter of hope in her chest. The dough received an extra firm punch as she pushed away thoughts of deep brown eyes and gentle hands. She wouldn't admit, even to herself, that every hoofbeat on the trail made her pause, that every shadow at dusk made her heart skip. Clara sat at the kitchen table, carefully practicing her letters while James mended a bridle nearby. The scratch of her pencil and the crackle of the stove created a peaceful melody that almost masked the emptiness of the house. That night, after the dishes were dried and the evening prayers said, Eliza settled into her cold bed. The wind whistled through the eaves, carrying memories of warmer days. She had almost drifted off when tiny footsteps padded across the wooden floor. "Mama!" Clara's voice wavered in the darkness. "Can I sleep with you?" Eliza lifted the quilt, and her daughter crawled in beside her, small fingers clutching her nightgown. The child's next words pierced straight through her heart. "I miss Pa." Eliza's throat tightened. She stroked Clara's hair, letting silent tears fall into the darkness. She hadn't given the children permission to call him that. They'd chosen it on their own, their hearts recognizing what she'd been too afraid to see. Miles away, Boaz stood in Miles City's only saddle shop, examining a pair of sturdy boots to replace his trail-worn ones. The leather was good. It would last through the spring planting. His eyes caught on a display of ribbons near the counter, and he found himself reaching for one in particular. The blue silk matched the color of Eliza's best dress, the one she'd worn to the harvest social. "That'll be $2 even," the shopkeeper said, wrapping the ribbon in brown paper. "Mighty pretty color." Boaz nodded, tucking the small package into his coat pocket. The next morning dawned clear and cold as he hitched a team to a rented buckboard. He'd traded 3 days' labor for the use of the wagon, knowing he couldn't carry what was needed on horseback. He worked methodically, loading supplies with careful precision. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of sugar, 3 bolts of sturdy oilcloth to patch the barn roof, lengths of calico in cheerful patterns that Clara would love. Each item chosen with purpose, each one a promise of continued life on the ranch. The journey home was slow and treacherous. Snow drifted across the trail, obscuring landmarks. Boaz relied on his scout training, reading the lay of the land beneath its white blanket. He made camp each night in sheltered hollows, tending the horses with care and sleeping little. His thoughts stayed fixed on the ranch, on James's quiet determination to learn, on Clara's bright laughter, on Eliza's grace as she moved through her daily tasks. The memory of her hand reaching for his that night by the hearth warmed him more than any campfire. 4 days into the journey, as the sun began to set, Boaz reached the final ridge overlooking the ranch. He pulled the team to a halt, his breath catching at the sight below. Through the gently falling snow, a warm light glowed in the farmhouse windows, like a beacon calling him home. The lamp's glow spilled across the white ground, creating long shadows in the gathering dusk. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the promise of warmth within. Even from this distance, he could make out fresh tracks in the snow, small boot prints that would be Clara's, larger ones from James carrying in firewood, and Eliza's delicate steps between house and barn. Boaz sat motionless for a long moment, taking in the scene. This wasn't just land to be worked, or a marriage of convenience anymore. Somewhere between that first day with the broken wagon tongue and now, it had become something else entirely. Something that made his chest ache with longing and hope. He gathered the reins, ready to guide the team down the final stretch of trail. The ribbon in his pocket seemed to carry the weight of all his unspoken words. The light in the window drew him forward, promising more than just shelter from the storm. In that quiet moment, as snow fell softly around him, Boaz understood what he'd known all along. He was coming home to more than a ranch. He was coming home to family. The storm grew fierce as midnight approached. Wind howled through the valley, driving snow against the farmhouse windows. Eliza sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in her wool shawl, unable to sleep. The lamp burned low as she watched the darkness beyond the glass. A muffled thump on the porch made her freeze. Heavy boots stamped snow from their soles. Her heart thundered as she crossed to the door, one hand clutching her shawl tight. She opened it to find Boaz filling the doorframe, snowflakes caught in his dark hair. His face was wind-burned, his clothes crusted with ice, but his eyes were warm and steady as they met hers. Before either could speak, running feet pattered across the floor. "Pa!" Clara's cry split the silence as she and James launched themselves at him. Boaz caught them both, dropping to one knee to gather them close. His large hands were gentle as he smoothed Clara's sleep-mussed hair and clasped James's shoulder. "I brought you something," he said softly, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a length of blue ribbon for Clara and a new leather pouch for James's marbles. The children clutched their gifts, pressing closer to him as if afraid he might disappear again. Eliza stood rooted, drinking in the sight of him. "The land?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Boaz looked up, his expression brightening. "It's safe, all of it. The chaplain remembered me clear as day. His testimony proved my rights were legal and binding." He stroked Clara's head as she yawned against his shoulder. "Todger's influence is finished. The agency reversed everything." Eliza's lips parted to speak, but Boaz carefully disentangled himself from the children. Still kneeling, he turned to face her fully. Snow melted on his coat as he reached for her hand. "Eliza." His voice was low, filled with meaning. "I came back not just to tell you this. I came to ask—" He paused, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Will you marry me again? Not for the ranch, not for help with the work, but because I love you and I want to be your husband in truth." Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Boaz stood, drawing her into his arms. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of snow and leather and home. His heart beat strong and steady under her ear. Outside, the storm raged on, but its fury seemed distant now. The falling snow muffled all sound until there was nothing but the quiet of their breathing, the sleepy murmur of children, and the profound silence of love finally spoken aloud. Spring painted the valley in tender greens and golds as townsfolk gathered behind the Morley ranch. Cottonwood fluff drifted like snow in the warm afternoon air, settling on the wooden chairs arranged in neat rows beneath the spreading branches. Reverend Calvin stood beneath an arch woven with wild roses, his weathered face beaming. This time, there was no hesitation in his manner, only joy as he watched Boaz waiting at the front, tall and dignified in a new black coat. The crowd turned as Clara appeared, her dark curls crowned with ribbons. She scattered wildflowers from her basket. Purple lupine and golden prairie stars gathered that morning. James followed, proudly bearing a small cushion with the ring, his Sunday shirt crisp and gleaming in the dappled light. Eliza emerged from the house in a dove-grey dress she'd sewn herself, trimmed with lace saved from her mother's wedding gown. Her steps were sure and steady as she walked the path between their neighbors and friends. This time, there were no whispers, only warm smiles and dabbed eyes. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Calvin began, his voice carrying clear across the gathering. "We come together to witness not just a union, but a testimony to God's perfect timing and grace." The ceremony flowed like the creek in springtime, simple, pure, and true. When James handed Boaz the ring, his small fingers trembled with importance. Boaz's large hands were gentle as he slipped the gold band onto Eliza's finger, his deep voice steady as he spoke his vows. Even banker Silas Durney, standing near the back, nodded approvingly, and later approached with genuine congratulations. The shame of Franklin Todge's schemes had opened many eyes, and the banker had learned wisdom from it. Word passed through the crowd that Todge himself had left town 2 days prior. His cattle empire crumbled under investigation. He'd slunk away in the pre-dawn hours, leaving only hushed whispers and unpaid debts behind. As evening settled over the land, lanterns twinkled in the cottonwoods. Neighbors shared cake and coffee, their laughter mixing with fiddle music. Children played tag between the trees, while older folks told stories of their own weddings long ago. Later, as stars began to peek through the branches, Boaz and Eliza sat together on their porch swing. Their shoulders touched as they watched Clara and James chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, their delighted squeals carrying across the yard. Boaz's hand found Eliza's, their fingers intertwining naturally now. The ring caught the last light of day, gleaming like a promise kept. They didn't need words to know what they'd found, not just a second chance or a convenient arrangement, but the gift of a full life stretching before them, rich with possibility and love. The weeks flowed like the creek behind the ranch, steady and sure. Spring mellowed into summer, bringing long golden days filled with purpose and quiet joy. The land responded to their care, growing richer under the touch of those who truly loved it. In the kitchen, flour dusted the air as Eliza guided Clara's small hands through the motions of kneading bread dough. "Like this, Mama?" Clara asked, her tongue poking out in concentration as she pressed her palms into the soft mound. "That's just right, sweetheart," Eliza answered, watching her daughter's determined efforts. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing above the workspace. These moments, teaching Clara the skills passed down through generations of frontier women, filled Eliza's heart near to bursting. Outside, the rhythmic sound of Boaz's hammer rang across the yard as he worked on the new corral. The fresh-cut pine posts stood straight and true, a testament to his careful craftsmanship. James perched on the top rail of the old fence, watching his stepfather work with undisguised admiration. Later that afternoon, James rode proud circles around the yard on Shadow, Boaz's old cavalry horse. The gentle beast seemed to understand the importance of his young rider, stepping carefully despite his battle-trained past. Boaz leaned against the new corral, arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the boy practice his seat. When Sunday came, they returned from church with hearts full of gratitude. The afternoon light painted everything in honey gold as they settled onto the porch, their Sunday best exchanged for more comfortable attire. Clara sat cross-legged on a quilted cushion, a small finger following the lines in the family Bible as she read aloud from Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," she recited carefully, her childish voice clear and sweet in the evening air. "I shall not want." James sprawled on his stomach nearby, idly whittling a stick with the small knife Boaz had given him, while the words of ancient comfort washed over them all. The windmill turned lazily against the darkening sky, its familiar creaks a counterpoint to Clara's reading. Eliza reached for Boaz's large hand where it rested on the porch rail, their fingers intertwined naturally now, a gesture as familiar as breathing. She turned to him with a smile that held all the warmth of their shared life. Boaz squeezed her hand gently, his deep voice soft with wonder. "Turns out, when a man sows kindness, he reaps a home." Through the windows behind them, lamplight spilled out in warm pools, promising comfort and shelter as evening drew near. The windmill continued its steady turning in the dusk, marking time like a heartbeat. Peace settled over their little patch of earth like a blessing, hard-won and precious. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.